On June 19, we are getting the Death of Robin Hood movie, and from everything we know so far, this is not the heroic version of the character. This is Robin Hood near the end, older, wounded, haunted. A man looking back on a life of crime, violence, and maybe even murder. Which is interesting, because before we ask whether Robin Hood deserves forgiveness, I think we have to ask why he existed in the first place. Now, I won't take too much of your time. By the end of this video, I want to show you why Robin Hood from 2010 is not really about a man becoming a legend. It is about a society becoming so broken that a criminal starts looking necessary. Robin Hood has always been a character looked at through a simple lens. He steals from the rich, he gives to the poor, he hides in the forest, he fights the corrupt king. And because the myth is so familiar, it becomes easy to see him as a justified hero. But Ridley Scott's Robin Hood from 2010 is different. It is not really about the legend yet, it is about the world that creates the legend. A world where war has drained the country, taxes crushing ordinary people, and the law does not feel like justice anymore. It feels like another weapon used by the powerful. So this video is not just about whether Robin Hood 2010 is underrated, it is about a harder question. What kind of society has to exist before a criminal starts looking like a hero? And to answer that, we have to start with the thing that frustrated a lot of people about this movie. Because the reason Robin Hood 2010 feels strange might also be the reason it is worth revising now. The strange thing about Robin Hood 2010 is that it almost feels like it is avoiding the version of Robin Hood people expected to see. If you go into this movie looking for the classic outlaw in the green hood, robbing rich men on forest roads and handing out coins to starving villagers, the movie can feel like it is taking too long to get to the point. But I actually think that is the point. He's not introduced as a symbol, he's not introduced as a revolutionary, he's not even introduced as a man with some grand moral mission. He is a soldier, a tired soldier, coming back from a war that has taken years from his life and given him very little in return. And that matters because the movie is not asking, what if a perfect hero decided to save the poor? It is asking, what has to happen to an ordinary man before he stops trusting the world around him? Robin begins as someone who has survived the system. He has served kings, fought wars, followed orders, and watched powerful men make decisions that ordinary people have to bleed for. So when he eventually becomes an outlaw, it does not feel like he simply woke up one day and chose rebellion. It feels like rebellion is what is left after every official path to justice has failed. But Robin being ordinary is only half the point, because ordinary people do not become outlaws in a vacuum. Something has to push them there, and in this movie, that something is England itself. This is where the movie starts becoming less about Robin as an individual and more about the world around him. Because before Robin Hood can become necessary, the society itself has to become unbearable. And in this movie, England does not feel like a country being protected by its leaders, it feels like a country being consumed by them. The king is presented as a man surrounded by war, ego, death, and entitlement. The people beneath him are not citizens he's supposed to protect, they are resources. Their bodies are resources in war, their land is a resource for power, their money is a resource for heavy taxation. And that is important because the movie is not just saying the rich are bad and the poor are good, it is showing something more specific. It is showing what happens when the people in charge still demands loyalty from a population they have stopped serving. That is the pressure point of the whole story. Because when people believe the law is unfair, they may still obey it. When people believe the king is selfish, they may still fear him. But when people start to believe that the entire system exists only to take from them, eventually, obedience no longer feels like morality. It feels more like surrender. And that is the space where Robin Hood is created. Robin Hood is created in the gap between what the law claims to be and what people actually experience. The law claims to bring order, but the people experience hunger. The crown claims to protect the country, but the people experience heavy taxation, war, and abandonment. The powerful claims to represent England, but the people are the ones paying the price for every decision those powerful men made. So by the time Robin begins to stand against that system, the movie has already made something clear. He's not rebelling against order. He's rebelling against a version of order that has already been corrupt. Because Robin Hood is not just a fantasy about stealing gold, he's a fantasy about someone finally making the powerful feel the consequences they usually escape. And once you see the world that way, Robin's crime starts to look different. Not innocent, not clean, but different. Because the movie is not asking us to excuse crime, it is asking us to compare crimes. And this is what makes Robin complicated. Because if we are being honest, Robin Hood is still a criminal. That is part of the myth that we usually soften. We call him a hero because he steals from the rich and gives to the poor, but he is still stealing, he is still breaking the law, he is still using violence, deception, and force to get what he wants. So the question is not, is Robin Hood innocent? The answer to that is no. The better question is, why does his crime feel different from the crime of the people in power? And I think the movie gives us an answer. Because the people in power are also taken from others, they are also using force, they are also creating suffering. The difference is that their version of theft is protected by titles, armies, taxes, and law. Robin's crime is illegal, their crime is official. And that is where the moral tension of the story really lives. Because once the system becomes corrupt enough, the line between order and oppression starts to blur. The law still exists, but it no longer feels like justice. The crown still has authority, but it no longer feels like protection. So when Robin breaks the law, the movie is not asking us to pretend that crime is good. It is asking us to notice that legality and morality are not always the same thing. That is why Robin Hood works as a character. He exposes the hypocrisy of a society where the powerful can take everything and call it duty, but when the powerless take something back, it is called rebellion. And this is also why he becomes necessary. Because the movie shows a world where the official version of justice has already failed. So Robin becomes something uncomfortable. He becomes a criminal who gives people a glimpse of what justice was supposed to feel like. He becomes an outlaw because the law has stopped protecting the people who need it the most. And that does not make every action right. It does not erase the danger of what he's doing. But it does make him understandable. Because in a fair society, Robin Hood would be a threat. But in a broken society, Robin Hood becomes the symptom. He is not the disease, he is the fever that proves the body is already sick. But even if Robin is understandable, that still does not fully answer the question. Because understanding why someone breaks the law is not the same as saying they are good. So we have to ask the uncomfortable version of the question. Is Robin Hood actually a hero? Or is he just the kind of criminal a broken society teaches us to admire? So, is Robin Hood good? That is the easy answer the legends want us to give. And on some level, yes, he stands with people who have been abandoned, he challenges men who believe power gives them the right to take whatever they want, he risks himself for something larger than survival. But I think the more interesting answer is that Robin Hood is not good because he breaks the law. He is good because he understands why the law has lost its moral authority. That is the difference. The movie does not make Robin heroic by pretending his actions are harmless. It makes him heroic by showing that his world has left people with no clean choices. And that is a much darker version of heroism. Because a clean hero saves the day without becoming part of the problem. Robin Hood cannot do that. He has to use the tools of a broken world to fight that same broken world. Force against force, deception against deception, theft against theft. That is why calling him simply good almost feels too easy, but calling him evil feels wrong too. Because evil, at least in this kind of story, is not just breaking rules. Evil is using power without responsibility. Evil is taken from people who cannot fight back and then calling it order. And Robin is not doing that. He is pointed in the opposite direction. The powerful take from the weak to protect themselves. Robin takes from the powerful to give the weak a chance. That difference matters, but it also does not erase the danger. Because once justice depends on one man outside the law, the question becomes, what happens if that man changes? What happens if his violence starts with the right target but does not stop there? That is where the death of Robin Hood becomes such an interesting contrast. Because Robin Hood 2010 shows us the beginning of the legend. It shows us why someone like him might be needed. But the death of Robin Hood seems to be asking what happens after a lifetime of being that person. After the crimes, after the violence, after the bodies, after the myth has had years to cover up the cost. And that is why Robin Hood is not just a hero, he's a warning. He's what happens when society fails for so long that the person who fights back has to become dangerous too. And that is where the story stops being only medieval. Because the reason Robin Hood still works is not just nostalgia, it is recognition. The costumes change, the kings change, the language changes, but the fear underneath the story stays familiar. And I think this is why Robin Hood keeps coming back, because even though the story is old, the fear underneath is not old at all. The fear is that the people making the rules are not always the people living under the consequences of those rules. That is what makes the Robin Hood myth so easy to understand across different times. You do not need to live in medieval England to understand the feeling of a system that seems distant, protected, and impossible to challenge. You only need to understand what it feels like when power becomes too comfortable. When the people at the top can make decisions that damage ordinary lives and then explain those decisions with language that makes the suffering sound necessary. That is why Robin Hood 2010 is more interesting when you look at it through a societal lens. Because the movie is not just showing poverty, it is showing the psychology of people who have been pushed to the edge. At first, people endure. They complain, but they endure. They fear the king, but they endure. They pay what they can, lose what they must, and keep hoping that maybe things will correct themselves. But there is a point where endurance changes into something else. There is a point where people stop believing that patience is a virtue, because patience has only given the powerful more time to take. And that is when someone like Robin Hood becomes emotionally powerful, because he gives shape to a feeling many people are not allowed to say out loud. The feeling that maybe the system is not broken by accident. Maybe it is working exactly the way it was designed to work. And when people reach that point, the question is no longer just, is rebellion wrong? The question becomes, what happens when obedience only protects the people causing the harm? That is the uncomfortable part. Robin Hood is satisfying as a fantasy, but in real life, that fantasy is dangerous too. Because if the only way people can imagine justice is through an outlaw, then that society has already lost something important. It has lost trust. Trust that the law will be fair. Trust that leaders will be accountable. Trust that suffering will be noticed before it turns into anger. And that is why Robin Hood is not just a character from the past. He is a pressure test. Every time his story feels relevant again, it says something about us. It says we are still drawn to the idea of a man outside the system because some part of us worries that the system will never correct itself from within. And that brings us back to the death of Robin Hood. Because if the 2010 movie shows us the beginning of this idea, the new movie seems to be looking at the other end of it. Even though it is not a direct sequel to the 2010 movie, it feels like it is asking the question that naturally comes after a story like this. If Robin Hood 2010 is about how a society creates an outlaw, then the death of Robin Hood seems to be about what being that outlaw does to the man. Because the Robin Hood myth does not always ask what happens to a person who has to live for years as a necessary criminal. What happens when violence becomes not just something he does once, but part of how he survives? What happens when the world keeps asking him to be dangerous because no one else is willing to be responsible? That is the part of Robin Hood that feels easy to ignore. And that is where the older Robin Hood becomes so interesting. Because if the 2010 movie shows us why Robin had to exist, then a story about his death can ask whether that justification was enough. Was he still a good man after years of crime? Was he still the same person after years of violence? Or did the world that created Robin Hood also slowly destroy him? That is why I think these two versions can speak to each other. One is about the birth of the myth, the other seems to be about the weight of the myth. And together, they make the Robin Hood story feel less like a simple fantasy and more like a tragedy. Because maybe the saddest part of Robin Hood is not that he becomes an outlaw. Maybe the saddest part is that he becomes necessary, and then people expect him to carry that necessity forever. So when I say Robin Hood 2010 deserves another look, I do not mean it suddenly becomes a perfect movie. I mean it understands the most important thing about the myth. Robin Hood is not powerful because he's simple. He's powerful because he is uncomfortable. Robin Hood is not just a man who steals from the rich and gives to the poor. He is what appears when people stop believing justice will arrive through the proper channels. He is what happens when the law still exists, but trust in the law has collapsed, and that makes him inspiring, but it also makes him frightening. Because a society should not need Robin Hood. This is a part of the myth we do not always want to sit with. We enjoy the fantasy of the outlaw who punishes corruption and protects the poor, but the need for the fantasy comes from somewhere much darker. It comes from the fear that power will not correct itself. It comes from the fear that suffering will be ignored unless someone forces the world to look at it. It comes from the fear that sometimes the person breaking the law may understand justice better than the person enforcing it. And that is why Robin Hood still matters, because he leaves us with an uncomfortable question. If Robin Hood is a criminal, why do we keep wanting him to be real? And maybe the answer is because deep down we understand that Robin Hood is not really the dream. Robin Hood is the warning. The dream is a society where he is no longer necessary. And maybe that is why this character keeps surviving. Not because every version gets him right, but because every generation seems to find a reason to need him again. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe, and turn your notifications on so you don't miss any of my videos. And let me know what version of Robin Hood you think gets the character right, because with the death of Robin Hood coming out, I think this is the perfect time to look back at what this character actually represents. Not just the hero, not just the outlaw, but the kind of world that makes someone like him possible. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.